Hello, and thank you for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk to you about a topic that has plagued me my entire career, and that's imposter syndrome. I first experienced my imposter voice when I went off to college. As a Black female science major, I often felt like I didn't belong. It took me 4 years to get my Bachelor's of Science at Edinburgh University, 4 years to get my Master's of Science at ASU in geology, and then 8 years to get my PhD while working full-time here at South Mountain Community College. That's 16 years of higher education, and I did not have a single Black female science professor in that time. Not only that, I was the only Black female in all of my programs. So I often felt like an outsider having to work extra hard to prove that I belonged. While pursuing my science career, I also engaged in all kinds of extracurricular activities. I traveled and taught around the world. I got scuba certified. I learned to play ice hockey. I had adventures like bungee jumping, and I even got my pilot's license. But no matter wherever I went or whatever I did, there was very few people that looked like me. By not having role models, I often felt like I didn't belong, that I was an imposter. For example, in my mid-20s, I decided that I was going to become an ice hockey player. So I went to the local ice hockey rink, and they had an adult learn to play ice hockey program, and the instructor told me that if I really wanted to get good, then I needed to go and skate during the day in pickup hockey. So I remember showing up with my hockey bag and walking into the locker room, and I was the only female, and I was the only minority. And none of the guys talked to me in the locker room. I sat on the bench. None of them talked to me while I was on the bench. I remember I would take my shift and I would skate up and down the ice, and nobody would pass me the puck or even really acknowledge that I was on the ice. And then I would go back and I would sit on the bench, and I just remember the voice inside my head telling me, I do not belong here. I should just get up and go. I do not belong here. I should just get up and go. And I remember countering this voice in my head, and I just sat there and I thought, no, I paid my $10. I deserve to be here. And this happened every single week. And I tell you what, I wore those guys down. It may have taken 6 months, but they eventually started talking to me in the locker room. They started talking to me on the bench. They started passing me the puck, and I became so good at ice hockey that I ended up skating for the ASU women's ice hockey club team for 4 years, and I was the captain for 2 of those years. So even though I was filled with this self-doubt, I didn't let the voice inside my head deter me from doing something that I really wanted to do, and that was to learn to play ice hockey. Imposter syndrome is when you are fueled internally with this thought of not being good enough or successful or a fraud, even though you have the talent, you have the knowledge, you have the ability to be successful. Raise your hand if you have ever heard a phrase similar to what I have up here in your head sometime during your career or your life. Raise your hand if you have felt or experienced this. I remember when I first learned the word imposter syndrome. I sat there and I thought, wow, that's me. I have imposter syndrome. And once I knew what it was, I could do research. And what I learned is that I am not alone. We are not alone. Most people are going to experience some form of imposter syndrome sometime in their life. What really matters is how we deal with it. And what I realized is that if I engaged that voice, that imposter voice from within, I could really determine the things that I wanted to do. And so I'm going to share with you an example where I had my biggest imposter syndrome moment. And it really wasn't a moment because it stretched an entire year. So I'm going to start with, who here would want to be an astronaut? Who are my A's? Raise your hand. A's? Oh, we got a couple of A's right there. Who are my B's? Got to get paid. Ah, right there, there's always a few. Yep, show me the money. And then who are my C's? I'm staying here on Earth. And so we've got a lot of C's. So I remember when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. I was born on Guam because my father worked for a NASA contractor during the Apollo missions. So I literally grew up with Neil Armstrong's autograph to my father on his office wall, along with all kinds of cool NASA certificates. So NASA and the astronaut program was something that I was very familiar with. But I was also a military aviation junkie. I loved military aircraft. I built model airplanes. I was in the Civil Air Patrol. And I had a plan. I was going to go to the Air Force Academy. I was going to become an F-16 fighter pilot. And then I was going to transition into the astronaut program. And I was going to end up being the shuttle commander. That was my plan when I was 12, 13, 14. And then about 15, I got glasses. And at that time, you were not going to be able to be a military aviator if you didn't have good eyesight. And so for me, my dreams of becoming an astronaut ended at that time because the other astronauts, the mission specialists, in my mind, they were rocket scientists. They were people who went to MIT and Yale and Stanford and Harvard, and that wasn't going to be me. So I gave up on the dream of being an astronaut, and I just lived my life. And then about 25 years later, I got an email from a friend that said, NASA is looking for astronauts, you should apply. I'm pretty sure I laughed out loud when I opened that email. But then I looked at the requirements, and I realized I had a PhD, I had my pilot's license, I was scuba certified, I don't speak any Russian, but I had traveled and taught around the world. Now, the imposter voice inside my head was telling me, they will never pick me. They will never pick me. And right then and there, I could have talked myself out of applying. But I said to myself, I was like, okay, they may never pick me, but I'm qualified, so why not just apply? And I did. In 2009, NASA had about 3,800 people apply for the astronaut program. From that 3,800, 2,800 approximately were considered qualified. From the 2,800, NASA determined who were the highly qualified. And from that pool of highly qualified, they were going to choose 110 individuals to go to Johnson Space Center for 3 days of interviews. I remember when I learned that NASA was thinking about interviewing me. I was walking across South Mountain Community College's campus, and my boss at the time came up to me, and she said, "This guy from NASA keeps calling about you. His name is Melvin, Leland Melvin." And I stopped her and I said, "You mean Leland Melvin, the astronaut?" And she stops and goes, I better get back to him then. The next thing I realize is that I am at Johnson Space Center, and I am surrounded by the most amazing individuals. There were fighter pilots, there were medical doctors, there were professors from MIT and Harvard. And you know what happens when you get into a group like this? The first question people ask you is, what do you do? And I said, I'm a community college professor in South Phoenix, Arizona. And then in my head, I heard, "What are you doing here? You do not belong here." And I told myself that, yes, I don't belong here, but that's not going to stop me from enjoying the moment. Because when I go home, they're not going to call me back. So I went home, and from those 110 individuals, NASA was going to choose 47 back for final interviews. I remember the day the phone rang, and the lady said, "This is NASA Johnson Space Center." And I said, "Oh my God, are you sure?" And she said, "Yes. Can you be here in 2 weeks?" And I was like, "I could be there tomorrow if you're sure." And so I ended up going back to Johnson Space Center, but this time for a week, where I got to interact with astronauts. I got to engage in all kinds of fun activities. I even had a medical that basically looked at every inch of my body. That is my brain. The diagnosis came back grossly normal, which really matched the narrative in my head, because I felt ordinary and astronauts were extraordinary. I went home and I waited for a yes/no phone call. Out of the 47, NASA chose 9 astronauts, and I was not one of them. I immediately filled myself with self-doubt, thinking they finally figured it out. I was an imposter. I was not good enough. So I enrolled in a master's program at North Dakota State for space studies, even though I already had a PhD. I told myself that I was going to get my advanced scuba. I was going to get my commercial pilot's license. I was even going to learn Russian. And then I stopped. And I said, "What am I doing? I just had the most amazing experience of my life. I was a NASA astronaut finalist. And instead of letting the voice from within consume me with self-doubt that I wasn't good enough, I decided that I would change that narrative, and that I would tell myself that the reason why NASA did not select me is not because not because I'm an imposter or a fraud. I am highly qualified. I made it to the top 1% of the NASA astronaut program, and that I would celebrate that. So I dropped all of that, and I continued to live my life. And it turns out that I ended up living in analog simulations. An analog simulation is when people come together and they live in a remote site and they do research to advance human space flight. So I lived for 4 months in the NASA-funded High Seas Mars simulation in Hawaii. And this past summer, I lived for 2 weeks in the Lunaris moon simulation in Pila, Poland. So I may not have been selected for the NASA astronaut program, but I am an analog astronaut. When it comes to the voice in my head, it's something that will always be with me. But I don't let it stop me from pursuing the things that I really want to do. I realized that if I could control the conversation with the voice from within, then I could achieve even my childhood dreams of becoming an astronaut. Thank you.